Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the latest edition of the Alberta Spore Support Unit's Knowledge Translation Platform's webinar series. Today's session is entitled Evaluating Research Impact from General to Specific. My name is Denise Thompson, and I am the Associate Director of the Alberta Spore KT platform. And for today's presentation, we have two presenters, Dr. Bergen of Knowledge to Action Consulting and Elizabeth Shantz from the Canadian Water Network. So before we begin, I'd like to mention that the session is recorded and that the link to view the recording of the session will be provided along with the participation slides to all participants after the session. I hope you enjoy today's session. If you would like to share ideas for future webinar topics and speakers, please feel free to leave a comment in the feedback form that will be sent out to you after today's webinar. So, on behalf of the Knowledge Translation Platform, I welcome Dr. Bergen and Elizabeth Shantz, and will now hand the microphone over to them.
Great, thank you very much, and we're delighted to be here. So we hope that you can all hear us okay. If you can't, let us know in the chat window. So we're sitting here on the University of Waterloo campus, looking outside the window at some nice snow that's coming down on us. And we're excited to be talking to you about evaluating research impact today. Elizabeth and I worked together this summer on a project looking at the research impact of the body of work of the Canadian Water Network. So what we'll be doing today is sharing some general evaluation ideas about research impact and how to assess it, and then specific examples from the Canadian Water Network. So a little bit about our slides. We've Creative Commons licensed them, so you're free to share them and reuse them for any purpose, as long as you give us attribution and you share what you create in turn. So a little bit about us. Knowledge to Action Consulting is a Guelph-based operation, and we offer services in evaluation, applied research, and knowledge mobilization.
Canadian Water Network is an organization that works between academia and governments, NGOs, and industry who deal with water policy and practice. And we address Canada's key water-related issues, including the safety and sustainability of municipal water supplies, water use and energy and resource development, water and nutrient management in agriculture, and water management solutions that fit small and Aboriginal community needs. We use a collaborative, consortium-based approach to ensure that the right knowledge is available to inform practice, policy, and investment opportunities. And we do this by bringing together end-user groups with common challenges, funding and managing research that answers these challenges, and ensuring that end users can access and apply this knowledge for success. And as Anne mentioned, we recently finished up an evaluation of the research projects that we funded since our creation in 2001, and we're going to be referring to this evaluation as an example throughout the presentation.
So if you have any questions after the webinar today, feel free to get in touch with us. You can find us through our website or our email or through social media. We're on Twitter, and we love to talk about evaluation and research impact. So do get in touch if you have questions afterwards. If you have questions during the presentation, we're going to try and keep an eye on the chat window during the talk. If there's a lot of questions, we may not see everything. Yes, you're supposed to hear now. So hopefully you'll be able to hear in spite of the background noise. We've done the setup, and we're going to have to sort of carry on with the room we've got. So anyway, questions during, we can see you typing, but if a lot of you type at once, we may have to do a roundup at the end of the session. We're going to try to leave 10 minutes at the end for questions, and we'll carry on with what we can do during. So, all that being said, let's dive into it. And remember that you can download the slides in the little box on the bottom right of your screen. So you don't have to type madly, you can just take a look at the slides. Why research impact evaluation? I think there's a lot of good answers to this question, But for many people, the reason that you're evaluating research impact is that somebody has asked you to do so. It could be an accountability question. It could be that your funder wants to know about the impact of research, or you are a funder. You fund research, you carry out research, and you want to know which of your research projects and programs are most impactful. What difference are they making in people's lives and in society? But the question of research impact is also tricky because there's not just one kind of impact, and impacts can be different at different times. So you want to ask the question, what kind of impact? When will the impact happen? The impacts that happen right after a research project or during a research project are very different than the ones that can happen 10 or 20 years down the line after an entire body of research is produced. For whom are the impacts? Are they for everybody, the entire public, some sort of subpopulation, or maybe a specific set of policymakers that you're trying to target with your research? You might want to think, under what conditions does research impact happen? Does the research or a particular kind of research always lead to a certain kind of impact, or is there a particular context that needs to be in place for the impact to happen? And finally, the big question is impact based on what kind of evidence? There's a continuum of evidence, I think, in terms of research impact evaluation. And at the one end, you've got an anecdote. Somebody said, wow, this piece of research, it really changed things for me. And you've got one person saying one thing. And at the other side, you might have a very involved study for an intervention, a knowledge translation intervention. You've got a randomized controlled trial, and you collect a lot of specific research evidence about your research impact. So there's a whole continuum of evidence, and we're going to talk about different ways of disentangling that and biting off a manageable piece for your research impact evaluation. So just like any evaluation project, research impact evaluation, a best practice is to start by defining your evaluation goals. So what is the purpose of doing this evaluation? What do you want to find out? So during this presentation, I'll be using the terms research impact and KT somewhat interchangeably. I think KT, knowledge translation, is the process of going from research to action or from research to impact. So you might have a research output, or you might have a KT output, like they could both be a poster. So for your evaluation, you might ask, what aspects of your research or KT do you want to evaluate? And then the really big question is, what are you going to do with the resulting information? You can track a whole lot of information about the research process and research outputs, but if nobody wants that information and nobody wants to use that information, then is it worthwhile collecting? So think about what parts of your research you want to evaluate, and what are you going to do with the resulting information? Who wants to know? What are you going to change? So when you're thinking about research impact evaluation, there's a continuum of evaluation, starting with the outputs of research, all the way through engagement, uptake, use, and impact, and then sometimes even causal attributions from research to impact. So the outputs of research are things like journal articles or posters, maybe a meeting that you have with a patient advisory group. Engagement overlaps a little bit with outputs, but engagement is where people start to notice and become aware of the outputs of research or the research project. Uptake is when people take on new information, and use is then actually using that information to make decisions or inform policy. And impact is what comes after that. What difference does it make if you create a new policy, or if a piece of research informs your behavior and you use it to direct your daily life or your organizational practice? What difference is there at the end? And then again, think back, how are you going to use the evaluation results? So once you find out what impact there is at a certain point in time, what are you going to do with that information? And what difference will that make for you?
So at the Canadian Water Network, when we started our evaluation, we knew that we had to narrow down exactly why we wanted to evaluate and how we were going to use the results. And coming up with these goals and refining them was actually quite a work in progress. So the first thing we wanted to know was what characteristics of the projects we fund are linked to projects that have strong impacts. And we wanted to know that so we could apply those lessons to future projects and future research. Secondly, we wanted to compare the different kinds of research that we fund. We wanted to know whether there were differences between the more traditional researcher-directed projects that we fund and projects in our consortium program that involve a much stronger level of end-user involvement. Thirdly, we often need to know knowledge about our projects in the aggregate. So we'll get questions about how many dollars have gone into small systems related research, for example, or how many projects a certain partner has been involved in. So we wanted to develop a database that we could query for this information when we needed it. And finally, we wanted to learn more about the impacts of our research, especially those that affected policy and practice, in order to inform our own communication strategy and help us identify and tell our success stories.
So further to defining your research goals or your evaluation goals for evaluating research impact, I think that John Lavis has done a really great job of spelling out key questions for KT, which can be rephrased as key questions for research impact evaluation. So first, what research knowledge was transferred? To whom was it transferred? By whom was the research knowledge transferred? How was it transferred? And finally, with what effect was the research knowledge transferred?
So when we looked at these questions in our own evaluation, we really saw them as sort of in descending order, from easy to difficult to answer. So as a research funder, projects submit yearly reports to us, so we already had information on the first three questions from these reports. On the fourth question, we know some information about how research was transferred during the project, but since reporting ends after a project is complete, we know that there were outputs that we didn't know about. And finally, we knew that we'd have to do some digging to answer that last question, which is what we really wanted to know about impact.
So once you have your evaluation goals in place, you want to start thinking about the broader context of your evaluation. And I like to think start by thinking about stakeholder involvement or engagement. So thinking about how engaged your stakeholders are, or your end users are, in your research and KT activities. So this series of arrows here is adapted from Arnstein's ladder of public participation and the IAP2 spectrum of public participation. So at the beginning, we have the least impactful form of research output or KT. We have informing people. So this is when you give somebody a piece of information. Here's a pamphlet. It has what you want to know. And you go away and hope that they're going to act based on that pamphlet. Well, we know that people are more likely to change their behavior and we're more likely to have impacts on policy and practice the more closely involved stakeholders are in the research and KT process. So if you consult people so that you can tailor information, perhaps you have an advisory committee, again, of patients or families and caregivers, and you involve people in that research process or the KT process, they're more likely to pay attention to the information you're sharing, and you're more likely to share information that will be meaningful and relevant to people that they're going to want to take up and use. If you're collaborating with people, you're making decisions together about what the research will look like or what the KT activity will look like. And then empowerment is the end where your stakeholders have full control over what the research looks like or what the KT activity looks like. So most of the time, I think we end up somewhere in the middle. Ideally, we're going to have some sort of end user or stakeholder involvement throughout the research and KT process so that we can stay on track and create materials that people want to use and want to pay attention to and want to use in their own lives and practice. But the extent to which this looks like collaboration versus consulting really, again, depends on your organizational context and how much time you have. The more you collaborate, the slower it is, but it's more impactful. You also want to think about context in terms of what you're trying to evaluate. Are you trying to look at a single product of research, one output, or maybe a whole research project? Then again, you might be looking at a program of research. And the broader the research program is, the more likely that you're going to be able to identify impact. What is the impact of a single piece of research? That's often really, really hard to define. But if you're looking at a program of research, or if you're a research funding organization, then especially you need to also think about the broader context. So who's funding the research funding organization? What do they have to report? Who wants to know about the information, and what's possible to collect if you're looking at years or even decades of research? Another good way to think about the context of evaluation is in terms of macro and micro factors. So micro factors are things like time and money, resources. Do you have funding to do this evaluation, or are you trying to do it off of the corner of your desk? Do you know what the intended use and intended users are, or is this out of interest because you want to do research that's as impactful as possible for your own satisfaction? What are your reporting requirements? Do they make sense with the evaluation plan that you have in place? And then at a more macro level, what does your organization look like? Does the leadership support evaluation? Is there a framework in place for research impact evaluation that you should be using, one that's been predefined, or are you starting from scratch? What external systems are going to have an impact on your ability to report both success and failure of research? And by failure, just because a research doesn't have impact right away doesn't mean it never will. So if you fail to show research impact in year one, does that mean that there's no impact, or just that it hasn't emerged yet? Also thinking about political climate and end users' ability to report that they are using research. It may be that people are using research but aren't able to go on the record in saying that they've used a particular piece of research. So one way to start to bring all this together is to develop a logic model for research impact. In my own evaluation practice, I try to start with a logic model or theory of change to define the logical links between the activities and outputs and desired outcomes for the project. When you're making a logic model, I think it's a good idea to start with the question of who are your stakeholders or end users? Who are the targets of change? Who do you expect to be impacted? Are you mainly trying to reach other researchers? Are you trying to reach a specific patient population? Are you trying to impact the public health of your entire province? Who are you trying to reach? And then what are your activities that might impact those stakeholders? Think about what you're creating in terms of in-person engagement. So this could be meetings, advisory committee meetings, just planning meetings. It could be phone conversations where you share a piece of research with somebody. It could be workshops or conferences. And then online and in paper, are you expecting people to find a piece of research that's published and is stuck up behind a journal paywall? Is your research open access and publicly available? Is there a plain language translation? What language is it in? Is it in the language of your end users? And is it written at a level that your end users can engage with? So spelling this out in the activities, together with the stakeholder analysis, can be a start for your logic model. Then you can go on to define what you expect in terms of outcomes and impacts. And you want to think about short-term changes, so changes in knowledge and awareness, that then lead into changes in skills and capacity and behavior. People change their decisions, they change their practice, they start to write new policies, and eventually we lead to system and community level impacts. Then you also want to think about the assumptions that link the activities and the outcomes. What needs to be in place for a research output to lead to an increase in awareness? Well, let's say I publish a report and put it up on a website. Somebody has to find that website. They have to be able to download the report, and the report has to be engaging when they look at it. It has to be meaningful and relevant to the end user's needs. Then in order for the end user to go from knowledge to actual behavior changes, that report has to be timely. in terms of decisions that they have to make, and the end user has to trust the source of the information. We know that any change in sort of behavior or policy or practice, these big changes, they're not based on single pieces of information. You can take on a piece of research or program of research, but that's going to be integrated with everything you know already and with the larger context. So spelling out those assumptions that are necessary for impact are really important, because then sometimes when you don't find the impact or outcomes you were hoping for, it could be that those assumptions weren't in place. Well, nobody downloaded the report because the website was down, or there was not sufficient internet access, or it was a really horrible PDF document.
So this is the logic model that we developed as part of our evaluation, and even before then. It's been adapted from the University of Wisconsin Extension logic model. So in each category, you see some of the indicators that we were interested in gathering during our impact evaluation. So the first thing we wanted to know about was project input. So what went into each project in terms of the research team, the partners, students, and the funding that was available for the project. Secondly, we were interested in the activities that were done and the outputs or the products that were created during the project, including reports, workshops, meetings, and publications. And we looked at each of these outputs and categorized them according to the intended audience. Finally, we wanted to learn more about project outcomes. So we did capture some information on academic-related outcomes like collaborations and partnerships, but we were most interested in outcomes that were related to end users. So these could be outcomes that occur in the short term, such as changes in knowledge or capacity at the individual level. They could be medium-term outcome changes, like changes in decisions, policies, and practice. And we were also interested in looking at the long-term impacts that result from these changes, such as a public health or environment impact that may happen as a result of a policy change. And in terms of assumptions, we are assuming connections between each step, although we do recognize that attribution for an outcome is rarely, if ever, as Anne said, due entirely to a single project or program. But we did want to try and get an understanding of how the project contributed to each change as best we could.
I think it's important to note, too, that this kind of logic model where you're seeing changes in awareness and knowledge leading to changes in behavior and practice and policies, and then larger systems-level impacts are how logic models are set up for social programs, or really any programs. So there's a lot of resources out there for developing this kind of logic model, and the lovely thing is, when you find one, you can adapt it. And then also think of the logic model as a living document. So the outcomes that you expect in year one of your project may not be the outcomes you start to uncover in later years. Once you have your logic model in place, start thinking about what approach to evaluation you want to take. And this is a little bit of a methods question and a little bit of a feasibility question. So you can start by thinking about what kind of evaluation you're doing. Are you doing capital E evaluation, little research, or is this capital R research? So what I mean by that is your focus on publication and generalizability, or are you doing evaluation for internal accountability and quality improvement purposes? Often this question comes down to whether or not you have funding. If you have funding to do a big evaluation project about the impact of your research, it's going to be much broader in scope than if you have no funding and are just trying to track a few things and gather a few success stories to learn about where your research is going. I think another piece that's different between the big E and the big R, evaluation versus research, is how much theory you need to embed in your research and evaluation. So if you're doing just a little bit of accountability, you might just have a quick checkbox and have a list of things that you look for, whereas if you're going to be doing some serious research and publishing and all that good stuff, you want to have a good theoretical basis from the evaluation literature for the approach you're going to take. And happily, there's a lot of great models out there that can be adapted. Later on, I'm going to showcase some work by Sarah Morton, who works on a contribution analysis approach to evaluating research impact. And finally, I wanted to point out here that you also want to set something that's feasible for evaluation. So if your evaluation turns so large that it overwhelms the research, and you're trying to find out the impact of your research, but the evaluation is also research, you end up in a sort of place where you're like a snake eating its own tail, and it's very difficult to proceed, and you're not going to have a good time. So again, come back to the question of who are your end users or targets of change of this evaluation. So it could be that you're trying to make a difference for patients or for families and caregivers. You might be doing more novel research where you're trying to reach other researchers and build an interdisciplinary team. You might be trying to reach practitioners or doing a really broad approach where you're trying to engage with the general public. There might be a particular policymaker or set of policymakers that you're trying to reach, or you're looking for a subpopulation. So for example, youth living in rural northern communities. So having this defined up front will help you know who to talk to later on when you're actually doing the evaluation. Because the piece here that's really important is that the end users know about the impact of research. The researchers know a little bit, but the end users are the ones who can tell you what's really going on and what difference the research made for them. You also, of course, need to think about what measures and indicators you're going to use. So if you're looking at outputs, it's very easy to collect metrics. You can count number of publications, number of citations. You can look at the impact factor of the journal or the number of times something was downloaded. If you're looking at engagement, even then you can still have some metrics. Number of people attending the meeting, number of people who retweeted something on social media, those sorts of things. But when you start to get into uptake and use, things get a little hazier, and it's a little bit harder to be able to develop specific quantitative metrics. What does use look like? What does it look like to use a piece of new knowledge or research information? So the time it takes and the complexity of measurement increases as you get further along this continuum. And I think that as you get into uptake and use and impact, the research becomes much more qualitative. It becomes about understanding narratives of research use rather than just counting things. So in terms of indicators, if you're looking at outputs, again, number and type of outputs or KT products. Did you make a poster? Did you make an infographic? If you made an infographic, what was the user experience if they're looking at that infographic? These are things that you can assess through a survey or a focus group. You could ask about the ease of use and the relevance. Was the information shared in a timely way that was meeting the needs of your end users? Then you can also look at assessing awareness and attitudes, beliefs and knowledge. And these are things that you can assess relatively easily through surveys and focus groups and interviews. Then we get into things like self-reported intentions and behavior, and if you're very well funded, maybe you could even follow people over time in a diary study. You can start to look at how networks and relationships change if you're doing interdisciplinary research. What sorts of collaborations are happening? And then even more broadly, what are the systems changes in policy and organizational culture? And these higher level, broader changes are typically going to be reported not just by getting somebody to fill out a survey, but really interviewing them in depth and creating a case study about that research impact. So remember that research impact is a social process. We don't share pieces of research knowledge or information as a little package that we can just sort of throw out there and people take up. We take on information from people we trust. So if Elizabeth told me about a new restaurant, I would be much more likely to go check it out because I trust her, as opposed to if I was given a pamphlet or an ad about that restaurant from somebody who I don't know and don't trust. So big impacts of research can be the quality and quantity of relationships, who's getting together and sharing information and knowledge. This could be one-on-one personal relationships. So for example, a PhD advisor and a student. The student may go off and form a new lab at a different university, and suddenly you have a research network. Or it could be organizational relationships, who's working with whom. Is there a collaboration between, say, policymakers and industry and researchers? What kinds of meetings are happening? Who's talking? Are you getting requests and referrals for information? And who are you working with on your research products? Does your social network look different at the beginning and the end of the research project? What about 10 years out? So these are things that you can track, but they're all social. So you have to really think about asking the right people the right questions and keeping track of who the right people are as that changes over time. This is a lovely example of indicators for research impact, and if you download the slides, it will likely be legible to you if it's not quite legible right now. This is for the Center for Research on Families and Relationships, put together by Sarah Morton. Like I said, she's from working at the University of Edinburgh and the Center for Research on Families and Relationships, and she's done great work on contribution analysis methods for evaluating research impact and has put together this lovely list of indicators for research impact that, again, is available through Creative Commons. So do check that out if you're trying to put together a list of indicators.
So when it came to time to start our own impact evaluation, as I mentioned, we're a research funder, so we have access to documents that projects have submitted to us through their lifespan. So the first stage of 3 stages that we did was document analysis. And our first step here was trying to decide which projects to include. So we chose to focus mainly on research-based projects rather than some of the standalone workshops or other knowledge translation initiatives we'd funded. And we also chose to focus on those that had been complete for 2 years or more in order to give some time for outcome changes to happen. We gathered all of the yearly project reports and any other publications or outputs that we knew about, and we analyzed and coded them to gather information on our indicators. So that included outputs, inputs, and outcomes where we had that outcome information. And we input all of these results into a searchable database. And this entire process took just over 6 months, and it let us gather information on 76 projects. Using the results that we had gotten during phase 1, our document analysis, we developed lists of the outputs and outcomes that we knew about for each project. And what we did was we arranged interviews with each researcher in order to verify and update the project outputs, because as I mentioned, we knew that there were outputs that had happened after the project had completed that we weren't aware of. And we also asked about outcomes. So what outcomes were the researchers aware of? And we asked them to suggest end users or partners they had worked with who had realized these outcomes, who we could speak with to learn more about each outcome. So after 9 months of interviews, we had interviewed researchers from 56 of the 76 projects, and those who weren't included either didn't respond to requests for interviews, or a few of them had retired or passed away, which is an unfortunate risk when you're doing this sort of long-term impact evaluation for some of our 10-year-old projects. In the third phase of our impact evaluation, we had interviews with end users. So we had originally intended to complete this in-house, but after spending more than a year of staff time working on the first 2 phases, we decided that it was just beyond our in-house capacity to do, and we brought in Knowledge to Action to help us with this step. So in this third phase, Anne and her collaborators spoke with the end users who had been nominated by researchers and some others that we thought could speak to outcomes, about the short and the medium-term outcomes that their organization had realized because of the project. They asked about the role that the project had played in this change, and also about the longer-term impacts, so these are things like environmental or economic impacts, that had occurred, or perhaps are likely to occur in the future as a result of this change. So this might be public health benefits because of a policy change. So we found that recording the anticipated impacts as well as the actual impacts, the quantified impacts, was important because these changes do take a very long time to occur. They're not always quantifiable, and they give us areas that we can continue to track into the future. So in this phase, Knowledge to Action spoke with 78 end users, and this took about 5 months.
And just a few more points about this part of the evaluation. So we did these interviews over the phone, and we recorded the interviews. We then got them transcribed, and we coded the interviews in terms of the Canadian Water Network logic model, so noting what were the short and mid-term outcomes, and then those longer-term impacts where people could speak to them. Another interesting piece about this was asking people whether they would like to be attributed as a source for this knowledge about the impacts of the research. So depending on where people were working and what their particular context was, they were or were not willing. But what we found was that the really great interviews were end users who wanted to be champions for this work. They really believed in it. They had a really great time participating in the research, and they were really, really excited to talk about all of the things that the research was doing and the difference that the research was making.
Absolutely. So just to bring this home with a couple of examples of what we found during the process, just in story form. Research by Chris Blah and his team at the University of Alberta found high levels of arsenic in the Campbell River in British Columbia and linked that arsenic to a nearby coal mine. And these findings led to the coal mine making multi-million-dollar investments to address arsenic contamination and helping to reduce arsenic to safe levels both for municipal drinking water supplies and for nearby fishery and the fishery tourism industry, which is very large in that area.
And this was an exciting project too, because this was somewhere where the impact could actually be quantified. You had an arsenic level before the research, and you had an arsenic contamination level afterwards, so you could see the impact of the research and then the remediation by the coal mine.
Yeah, absolutely. We were very excited by the potential to sort of quantify impact in that particular project. Another project by Michel Prévost at Polytechnique Montreal found that partial replacement of lead service pipes that are found in many municipalities' drinking water supply systems was linked to high blood lead levels in children. And this was a finding that caused a number of municipalities across Canada to change their lead pipe replacement programs and recommendations, and also informed provincial regulations and is having an impact on international regulations as well. So what did we learn from the year and a half or more it took us to do this evaluation? So it takes a lot of time and a lot of resources to do an evaluation on this scale. We had hundreds of pages of documents per project to go through, and it was very, very time consuming. That said, it was worth it for the results that we got and what we're going to be able to continue to do with them in the future. So, as Anne mentioned, that question, how are you going to use the results, is really, really key. We had initially just thought that this would be a comparison of particular programs, but it expanded as we went, and as the goals expanded, we found the questions that we were asking were moving to meet those expanding goals. Choosing your indicators is important. But also leaving yourself the freedom to add or remove indicators as your evaluation is going on based on what works and what doesn't work. And as Anne mentioned, leaving yourself the same freedom within your logic model to adapt and change depending on what you're hearing from the interviews that you're getting. Framing your question is really important. And we found that especially so when it came to describing what we mean when we say outcomes. So in the interviews, we found it really helpful to give participants a list of outcomes to direct the conversation, especially helpful that we had the list of outcomes that we knew about from phase 1 already that we could use as a basis for conversation. And then secondly, as a funder, we have already started to integrate questions about outcomes into our project reporting. So this gives us information that we can follow up on later more easily without doing the whole document analysis piece all over again. As Anne mentioned, getting the right people involved is really important. People who are willing to be champions, people who are excited about the project, who are involved and willing to speak to the benefit that the project had. Some people may have constraints around their ability to publicly speak about a project, but they're willing to speak with you, and then you can go back to them if you want to attribute something to them or their organization. If necessary, get other people to send emails or to make those connections if they've already got a pre-existing relationship with the person you're trying to get a hold of. And finally, persistence is a virtue. You have to remember that the evaluation is a great concern for you, but probably not for the people that you're trying to contact, especially if it's about a project that finished 5 or 10 years ago. So recognize that, use what avenues you can to get in contact with them, and follow up patiently. Finally, some of the things that weren't captured in our logic model, looking back upon the evaluation and based on the feedback from Knowledge to Action, that we're going to adapt our logic model to include in future iterations, include finding a way to capture the way a project advances the body of work of prominent researchers. And this is really important because this body of work can be really important in strengthening trust, both researcher to researcher and between researchers and end users, and helping them build those relationships. Secondly, we need to be able to capture advancements in methods, modeling, and technology as sort of a key outcome and not just an output, which is how we were previously measuring it. Thirdly, we need to find some way to capture the benefit of research that's in emerging or novel areas. This research might not be ready for application yet, so it might not have uptake because it's very new in its field, but we need to be able to capture in some way the importance of that research. So an example is some of the recent work on emerging contaminants in water. And finally, being able to track these impacts forward over time is going to be really important for our organization. We want to continue to track our impact over time and make sure that we are getting a full picture of how projects and our programs have affected environmental, public health, and economic benefits in Canada.
So more generally, I'm going to review a few promising practices and also tensions for research impact evaluation. The first one is that research impact evaluation ideally takes place by talking to partners and end users and stakeholders. You want to start by talking to the researcher and asking them who they think might be using their research and how, but then you need to work out from there. That's just a starting place. The researcher should not be the sole person reporting on the impact of the research because they don't know. They're not the ones using it. You want to think about forward and backward tracking. So you can ask end users and stakeholders that you know about to nominate other people who might have used the research and to get you in touch with them. And then you can work backwards. You could say, okay, here's a policy document, and this piece of research is cited in that policy document. Well, what else went into that policy document, and who created it, and who was using it? You want to think about contribution, that the fact that research contributes to outcomes and impact. It's not usually a sole direct cause. And so finding methods to talk about that usually look more like a case study and less like, let's say, something that would result in a punchy bar graph where you show the impact of your research in dollars. You can perhaps make an argument that your research has had a specific quantitative impact, but that's much more difficult to do, and you need to build in ways for end users to both track and report on that impact over time in quantitative ways if you want to do that. You also want to think about the tension between success stories versus quantified impact. Are you only looking for success stories? Or are you also going to capture the stories about what doesn't work so well? If you're trying to quantify impact and track things in terms of numbers or specific changes using, say, a scale of knowledge that's measuring knowledge or something like that, is that all you're tracking? Or do you have a larger narrative to explain what that looks like? And finally, you want to really think about the timing of impact. You may have to report on the impacts of your research right at the end of the project. Well, at that point, you'll be able to report quite easily on outputs, a little bit on engagement, maybe some uptake, But have you got to outcomes yet? Well, maybe changes in knowledge or awareness, maybe motivation, but the larger impacts take time. And like Elizabeth said, if you wait too long, somebody who has 20 years of research history behind them will have retired. And their partners who are out there actually using the research may have retired. When we were doing the interviews for the Canadian Water Network, about 5% of or more of the people we tried to talk to were unavailable to contact because they were off fishing somewhere. They were retired and they weren't doing that work anymore. So capturing the stories about impact as they're happening, which takes time, maybe years, maybe decades even, but before people are no longer there to report, is a tricky balancing act. And it really depends on your capacity to report and who's asking and how quickly you need to give them information. And finally, remember that just because you're reporting and looking for research impact and evaluating your research impact, if you're looking right away and you don't see what you're looking for yet, it doesn't mean that the research impact is not going to happen. It could mean that it hasn't emerged yet. So with that, we'd like to open it up to questions. And thank you to H for posting all of those great examples in the comment box. That looks awesome. Okay, so we have a little bit. We were cutting out a bit there, so we're asking for questions from the floor. You lost sound. Can you hear us still? So we're not talking right now, which could be why you can't hear us. People are losing sound. No sound. Okay, we're back. It says we're back.
All right, excellent.
So you can hear us. If you cannot hear us, we will start typing to you. Multiple attendees are typing. That's exciting. It comes and goes.
All right, excellent.
Okay, so if you type your questions, we can type answers and speak them. And then even if you can't hear us, we can respond. Thanks, Tanya. So yes, we're open to questions from the floor now.
Well, I have a question for Anne in the meantime while we're waiting for everyone to submit their questions, and we're happy to answer those. And what are some of the really promising practices in evaluation and trends in evaluation that you've seen over the last few years? Because I think that this evaluation piece is really becoming larger and larger. More funders are requiring it. More people are interested in tracking the impacts of the research. So have you seen any emerging trends in this field?
I think for me, the biggest trend and difference is that people are really starting to pay attention to evaluation. And that's in terms of social programs, but also in terms of research impact. And I think this is something that has been going on for a longer time in places like the UK. But as more and more people are trying to do it, we're starting to develop a really nice body of work about evaluating research impact, which is exciting. And I think that even though there's multiple ways of doing it, finding a systematic framework and working from within that framework, saying, this is our logic model, these are our methods, and then working within that and maybe doing a little bit of adapting as needed, but trying to set your framework at the beginning and not finding a project where the evaluation drifts could be really helpful.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so the piece about success stories, those I think are really good to collect. And I think it's always nice to have a little bit of lessons learned in the success story. Often it feels then that you're trying to sell something to somebody. Look how successful we are. We're just full of success all the time. But we know that any research project has problems because every project has some problems. So being able to point out what works better and what doesn't work as well in which context is really, really helpful. I think another trend in evaluation that can be helpful for thinking about research impact evaluation is the idea of having more stakeholder involvement and asking the end users, and not just having a researcher who decides what questions to ask, but having it be a more collaborative and participatory process.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the quantification of outcomes side, that was something that we were really interested in when we started off doing this. And I think as we went on, we realized just how difficult it was to quantify outcomes. Even though we're a funding body, we have our own funders to report to, so there's a natural lean towards quantification. But we do find that telling those stories can be really impactful, like the two that I mentioned, or others, because people connect to those on a personal level. So I think that there's real value in telling the success stories, even if quantification is difficult.
So going down the list of questions, Elizabeth, how long did it take to collect data for the evaluation, and how much resources did you have to invest?
Oh my goodness. A long time. So it was over a year and a half of solid data collection between the three phases. Longer than that to sort of set our indicators, set up our database, inputting stuff into the database. So those 76 projects in phase one, we had yearly progress reports, plus publications, the proposal, all the data that we gather on partners and funding through our statistical reporting system for each project. So you times, 200 pages, 300 pages by 76 projects just for the document analysis stage. It was huge. And then trying to track people down to get them on the phone for something that, again, it was much more difficult for the older projects just because people weren't interested in them anymore. So in terms of resources, it was mainly staff time. Myself and another staff member were working on this, and we also hired 2 interns to take on various pieces of each project. We found that this worked fairly well for us, but the way that we went about doing it with the 3 stages was certainly extremely resource intensive, and the database in particular was very difficult to update and maintain.
So the next question, where can we learn more about theories to inform evaluation? There's actually a resources slide that I forgot to click to at the end of the webinar, so if you download the slides, you can take a look at that. If you go to betterevaluation.org, there is an excellent collection of evaluation resources with different kinds of theories and approaches. Other than the resources identified by H and Sarah Morton, are there additional resources that you find useful? Yes, in the resources section. So betterevaluation.org, there's some nice work by the UK's Economic and Social Research Council and by the National Collaborating Centre for Methods and Tools on evaluating knowledge translation interventions. And those are some nice starting places.
Judy has a question about the number of surveys and how they're becoming overwhelming, and the number of complex questions are increasing.
Yeah.
So can you comment on how to select the tools you use to get the feedback needed without using surveys?
Yeah, and I think this is actually another trend in evaluation is over-surveying people. I think that sending out a survey by email is very unlikely to get a response. It's much better to bring people together in a room and have a conversation, like a focus group, or even having a Skype conversation or a phone conversation can be more helpful. If you are trying to reach out to a broad group by a survey, think about what's in it for them. Why are they going to want to respond to your survey, say on their lunch hour? Do they care about your research? Can you build in some sort of incentive or way of looping back in to make it worth their while to actually complete the survey?
Actually, building on that as well, so we did interviews rather than surveys. We toyed with the idea of doing surveys, but we had the exact same thought. The number of surveys people get are just overwhelming, and we didn't anticipate responses. So we actually found that the personal connection at the interview stage was really, really great. And what Anne said about what's in it for them was really key. So when we were trying to make times to interview our researchers, we pointed out to them that we were trying to, we wanted to know this so we could profile the success stories about projects that were really impactful. And sometimes after a project is done, they may lose track of their partners as well. So they had a personal interest in knowing how partners had used the information from their project. So the ability for them to learn that information after we had contacted their partners was really motivating, I think, for them.
So we've got a question from Magda over a long-term evaluation. How can you account for impact due to external factors from the research projects you're evaluating? So changes in popular media, things like that. And this is where I think a contributions approach comes in. So you look at the contribution of the research, but also the contributions of changing societal attitudes and changes in economy and changes in all of those other things that are impacting these outcomes aside from the research, and having a comprehensive list of things that are contributing to this impact rather than just saying, yeah, this research, look, did all this stuff. No, what else was going on? What was that broader context? Spelling that out really will increase the rigor of your results.
And so we'd certainly like to thank today's presenters very much. That was a really thought-provoking, excellent presentation. So thank you once again to all the participants for joining us today. As I mentioned earlier, this session has been recorded, and the link to view the recorded presentation will be emailed to all the participants who registered for this webinar. So stay tuned for that. Our next webinar will be on February the 10th and will feature Dr. Lisa Gerges and Dr. Xiao Li discussing researcher-practitioner collaboration and how this contributed to professional practice changes in Alberta's community pharmacies. And on the slide that's up now, you'll also see an ad for our March 9th webinar as well. So please feel free to click on the webinar images to visit the registration pages for those events. And also on this page is a link to sign up for our newsletter, which comes out every couple of weeks and will provide you with updates on more events that we're running in the future. So on behalf of the Alberta SPORE Knowledge Translation Platform, I'd like to wish everyone a great afternoon and hope to see you again next time. Thanks.